Hi, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak. Today, I'm Suran Ware. I'm the head of School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Newcastle. Today, I'm going to be talking about what's called radical hope, and I'll define that at the end of the talk a bit better. But I'm calling it radical hope and designing in a fragile world. I'm actually a landscape architect by training, so the work you'll see here today draws upon some of that. So just so you know, for a point of reference, Newcastle is down here just above Sydney, but today I'm actually coming from up here in far north Queensland, just in and around here. But all the projects you see will be from the Newcastle and Upper Hunter region, which again, I'll explain why that's important in a second. What we do in Australia traditionally, and I suspect some of my colleagues have already done this, is we acknowledge country, and it's a way to show respect for Aboriginal culture and heritage, and actually honor the traditional custodians of the land that we inhabit. So today I'm going to acknowledge the Yindinji peoples. They're the traditional owners and custodians of the land, sea, and waterways on which I am now located. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. It's also really important to understand that sovereignty has really never been ceded in Australia, and that all land in Australia and often beyond always will be, always was Aboriginal land. And we also need to recognize the past atrocities against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Because our land, our country was founded on genocide and the dispossession of the First Nations people. And coming from the built environment professions, this is we work on country, and not recognizing this and thinking about how we can change that is an important, awakening, I would say. So for those of you who are not familiar with Indigenous Australia, almost 500 different language groups. So if you're a North American nations, or if you're from another area, just imagine 500 different cultural customs. So it's quite diverse. Newcastle, where the projects I'm going to show you are today, are down around Awabakal and Worimi country. And their traditions are very different from, say, the Gunu or other places, and particularly the places where I am in far north Queensland, where it's incredibly tropical, and they have a very different cultural set of practices. So those things are important when you're a landscape architect or someone who's looking at the built environment. And if we're going to reinvent our curricula, if we're going to have different kinds of professionals, we've got to start thinking about diversity and inclusion and co-design in a very different way. So my first project I'm going to talk about really taps into SDG 5, which is around gender equity. I think most people, sorry, I'm going to move myself out of the way. Most people would recognize the SDGs. If not, the United Nations came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, all of which have marked and actual tangible things that they're asking us to do by 2030. In this instance, this particular project is really looking at how we can end forms of discrimination against women and girls. We can eliminate forms of violence against women and girls, and also young children. How we ensure women's effective and full participation and opportunity in leadership at all levels. How we give women equal rights to economic resources. And finally, promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls at all levels. So in UNSW in 2018, which UNSW, sorry, is another university, it found just over 12% of the construction industry workforce in Australia was women. And that was a 17% decrease from the past decade. Similarly, most of the managerial professions were men, only 12% were women. And essentially only 3% were at the very top. So what does that say about women in construction? And what does that say about women in that workforce? Well, it kind of tells you that we have a big gender gap. There are a whole bunch of recommendations in this particular report, but it started with the practices themselves, and really that companies themselves need to take responsibility for gender equity. They need to address work practices which aren't gender inclusion. All companies have to look at different stages of women's careers, which might be different to men's careers. Change policies, transparent recruitment practices, etc. Sorry. The other thing that when you look at built environment professions that you see, and this is the number of people who stay within these disciplines, women leave rapidly. So we graduate about 50-50, and in fact, we often graduate more women than men. But then look how many leave by the time they get in their 60s. It's incredible, just that it's a steep slope of women leaving the profession. And there's a number of challenges, and there's a whole range of reasons behind this, but what are we doing about it? Similarly, in my profession, landscape architecture, if you look at gender pay equity, you see some very startling things. So you might start off pretty close to a male colleague, but by the time you're in your 40s, you're 7%. And if you make it till you're 49, you're almost 30% below men in terms of what you're paid. This isn't about part-time or full-time work. This is based on the appropriate rate, as if everyone as if people were being paid the same rate per hour. So it has nothing to do about whether or not people are taking time off to have children. But you can see that if you're a woman, your career, you will always be underpaid when it comes to men. So what did we want to do about that in the School of Architecture and Built Environment? In a relatively small school in terms of the rest of Australia and in terms of internationally, but how do we want to attract and keep women in built environment professions? And so I'd say the first initiative was really about, you got to be it to see it. And I know that sounds very American and not so clever, but I guess what we did firstly is we basically set a target where we would have 50% men and 50% women working as academics in the school. So we're actually the first school, and I'm very proud to say this, that includes architecture and construction management that has a gender balance. We also have staff from 16 countries. So it's incredibly important for us to have diversity. We need to be diverse because we have diverse students, but we also have diverse challenges. And we're currently recruiting 5 Indigenous academic staff members. So we're set to really think about country and land in Australia very differently and decolonizing our curricula. There's also a thing around change comes within, and it's one thing to change a school, but it's another thing to start to change the university. A number of leaders in my school are working with the university's infrastructure and facilities services teams, those who procure the physical campus environments, to ensure that more women are employed as cadets, staff members, but also that more female-owned and Indigenous-owned businesses, construction companies, service industries, etc., are on our preferred tendered list. So it's not just about being equal within SABI, my school, it's also about having the university recognize that it needs to do its part. The last one I call put up or shut up, and it's probably what I'm going to talk about more today, which is really, we have a lot of challenges in the built environment, which is what I started off with today, showing you some of the stats. Particularly keeping women, attracting women, and then understanding the challenges they might face uniquely. So we started a social enterprise called Outfit, and because we didn't have any good opportunities available to our students in the region, and we also wanted to support staff, female staff and practitioners, but also male staff and practitioners a little bit differently than most universities. So one of the top reasons women leave isn't for pay, isn't for really difficult hours, but it's actually around wanting to make a difference in their community. They become architects, construction managers, project managers, disaster managers, landscape architects, because they want to make a difference in the world, and they didn't feel their work was happening in their workplace. So we started outfit. So what's outfit? Oops. Outfit promotes women in the design construction workforce in raising art profiles in local professions, communities, and provides some opportunities for challenging inequities. It's a collective of volunteers drawn from students, built environment professions, and we are located at the University of Newcastle. We have three ideas in our mission. The first is to improve students' confidence and creativity through working on design and build projects. To provide design, the second, is to provide design and build services for disadvantaged communities and needs. And three is to foster volunteerism and mentorship and sponsorship within professional practice and trades. So I'm going to show you our first project, which was Jenny's Place. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Hunter, one of the saddest and most difficult stats we have is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 3 children in our region, in our city, are victims of domestic violence or domestic abuse. And so Jenny's Place is a women's refuge, and it's a temporary housing and accommodation place where women can go take their children with them when they're leaving their abusers. It's a very humble place. It's a hidden place. So most of the slides I'm going to show you, the images I'm going to show you are de-identified. But essentially, we came in to help Jenny's Place with one project, and we've been working with them ever since. And so this first project was their play space. So you can imagine that the women who are wanting to be able to see their children play, but don't necessarily want to play with them at this point in time. They just need a bit of space and respite. So we decided, and you can see some of our volunteers and some of our mentors, some of our students, not just women or female students doing the work. Sometimes it's international students who don't feel confident on tools, and that this is a safe space to learn how to use tools, or it's a safe space to learn how to do a setup or anything like that. But we also have male students who volunteer who are highly skilled, and sometimes the female students are even more skilled than them. So we have mentors from the trades and professional practice who come in. But essentially, we just wanted to give them a good outdoor space where the women could get a bit of space, a nice place to sit and have a chat, but also a place where the kids could play that was safe. And so you can kind of see the little things we did in that very first project, you know, redoing a cubby house, putting in proper pavement for the barbecue area, turning a fence that looked like a jail fence into something a bit more colorful, just a lick of paint, a new straight shade structure. And this is some of the interior work we've done where we've taken out party walls. And again, so women are learning the skills that it takes to take down a wall, but they're also learning about how a wall gets constructed. And this is a very generous volunteer from practice who's come back to help us. We often get, you know, these really lovely thank you. And this is from one of the kids when we were at Jenny's Place. And, you know, them aspiring to join the built environment professions is such a lovely payback. Second project is just a little garden that we did. We often do a lot of projects for domestic violence centers or schools, which are terribly underfunded, and they're always in communities in need. And this particular school is a school for kids with various aspects of autism, or they're on various spectrums. And what they needed were places where they could have very detailed studies, nature play, things with a lot of grit, places where they could chill out, places where they could swing. And so this is a very simple plan, all built by volunteers, and all the materials were actually supplied by donors. And, you know, just planting a garden, doing, you know, a bit of temporary artworks, and then of course this kind of healing garden space, which the kids love very much, but very tactile plants. So we're often doing things like that for underfunded schools. I think we're up to 18. Dottie's a special project. Dottie, we discovered we were doing a lot in Newcastle, and certainly there's always going to be, unfortunately, need in Newcastle because there are a lot of disadvantaged communities and a lot of disadvantaged pockets. But we wanted to go a little bit beyond that, into the Upper Hunter, further north, further south. And so we applied for a grant, and we were able to get Dottie, you can see why we call her Dottie, a trailer who helps us travel. And this is when we got to christen Dottie, and a few Aboriginal dancers came and celebrated her with us. from the university. Dottie's enabled us to travel further afield. COVID's put a few restrictions on our work, but I'll end this section of my talk and then I'm going to talk about more of a research project. So this might be considered a research project with a very community engagement focus. And I think that one of the things we need to change about how we educate designers isn't just to get rid of the sort of authoritarian, I am the hero, I am the big D designer, and understand co-design. But I think the other thing we really need to think about is how do we make safe environments for people to help people and learn things that they may never do. Architects and construction managers may never be on the tools, but they need to understand how that works. And so how do we make a safe environment for people to learn that, not just physically, OH&S safe, but culturally safe? And so this particular project, we designed and built entirely during COVID. We had Newcastle Women's Domestic Violence Centre wanted a moot court. And so that's a fake court setting, if you like. So when you go to face when you decide you're going to level charges against your abuser, you have to go to court. You actually have to face them. And that's a pretty intimidating experience. So we built a highly well-crafted set of things like where the judge sits, where the prosecution sits, if you like, where the jury might sit, where you're going to sit to give your testimony. And we did that so that, and we take all ages, as you can see, but we did it because this client group needed a place where they can make women feel as comfortable and as confident as you could going up and facing their abusers. And so very different kind of project for us, but it was easier to do in a COVID environment. Now, obviously, we're probably in between lockdowns in this particular images. No, not probably, we are between lockdowns in this particular image, but you can see that sometimes we have to change the scale of what we do, and sometimes we have to do things which suit what's going on both in the community, in this case, during a global pandemic, but also the needs of the client more so than the needs of our great design aspirations, sorry. So the next project is really one of my research projects, but it's a collaborative work. And I thought I would highlight this for this conference in that really, and I'm framing things with the SDGs in mind because I think that they provide us the roadmap to the future, if you like. I think we often try to find, or invent our own roadmap or our own sort of touch points or tipping points. But the SDGs for me are really about how we're going to face some of the challenges, but also how we might start to think about ourselves differently when we graduate, but also as an academic. So the two SDG goals that this one really taps into is really about making cities safe and sustainable, and also really around sustainably managing what I would call highly degraded land. And again, I use these as aspirations, but I always find a few key collaborators in all my projects. But I think the SDGs tell us what we need to know. So I was reading over the prospectus for the conference and I thought, actually, most of the answers are here in the SDGs. So I think it's really helpful, and everyone in the world is working towards achieving the SDGs. So that to me is the kind of movement we need in the 21st century to shift things. So this is a really interesting collaboration. It's with two other universities, the University of Technology, Sydney, and I've been working with Dr. Megan Morrison, and she is the scientist on the project. And then we worked with a couple of artists from the University of New South Wales. We were funded and are funded, by Lancome and Urban Growth New South Wales, and also the University of Newcastle kindly gave us this particular site, which is on Awabakal in Worimi country. Sorry. So if there's anything if you've never had a chance to visit, Newcastle is a really beautiful city, but it has a very interesting and challenging past. It's very much a post-industrial city. If you're from North America or America, places like Erie, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, very heavy-duty steel towns. If you're from the UK, you're very well aware of these places like Salford, etc. One of the most challenging things about Newcastle is the amount of toxic land So they can't develop the site, they can't treat the site. There's a whole range of issues about why it's so toxic, probably some of the industries that were there, probably some of the industries that are still there. But we have some of the highest number of toxic sites in the state of New South Wales and indeed in the country. So fiber remediation is a process where plants basically absorb toxins. Some plants, just like your body, absorb toxins and they actually metabolize them, break them down, and when they evapotranspirate or basically perspire, they actually let go of the toxins, and the toxins are they're not harmful anymore, so they metabolize toxins. Some plants do that. Other plants will gather up the toxins out of the soil and put them in their roots, all right, and they'll hold those toxins in the root, but they'll no longer be in the soil. So they'll clean toxins out of the soil by putting them in their roots. Other plants actually pull them into their stems or their leaves or into their fruit and their flowers. And so this garden is one of the very first in the world where we're testing out in field conditions, different plants, both native and non-native to Australia, to see what toxins they'll take out, what they won't take out, what's safe to eat, what's not safe to eat, what's safe for the birds, what's safe for the bees. It's a really interesting garden, which also has a cultural aspect to it. So Del Pratt, which is the very first sort of CEO or site manager of BHP, which was a very large steel operation in Newcastle until 1999, had a cottage that he liked to look over and see his workers. It's about 6 kilometers, or it's just over 6 kilometers to the center of Newcastle from Del Pratt along the Hunter River, which is again where a lot of the industries were founded because they could get stuff in and out very quickly. Just looking at it a bit closer, it's a very large site. We're close to what's a major kind of thoroughfare on this side of town, on the north side of town. So why did we choose this project? Well, property, sorry, because there are lots of toxic sites in Newcastle. Well, one, the university owns the land and they were interested in what we could do. Two, it's a heritage site, so often heritage sites are quite limited in what you can build and do there. Three, it was highly toxic. So you had this incredible rich cultural history from BHP and being this cottage that was used by a number of the main guys who ran it, but also then had subsequent families move into it and things like that. It now houses the Newcastle Industrial Heritage Association, which are a number of retired BHP workers who are very proud of the work they did. There were over 12,000 of them that worked at BHP. What did we decide when we chose this site? There were some really great things. It's a heritage listed building. It's around Federation. So it became really important to think about, well, what does a garden look like? We don't want to have a heritage garden. We want to try a bunch of different things, but what can we do that will reference that? Similarly, well, what was the site before it became BHP and Del Pratt Cottage? It was originally, and you can see in this image, that it was originally in the swamps or in the estuary part of the river. And it was sited, it never got built to be botanic gardens, but it was an orchard before they built the house. So this is a bit of the construction photos of the house, and then this is the house as it currently stands. We decided to approach this in a really different way than we had other projects. We've done other projects in White Bay and Sydney, but we decided to look at this project in a very suburban, very, I'd say, digestible typology for the public. And that's because we wanted people, because yes, the land near BHP and near those heavy industries was heavily toxic, but so is the land across the road, partially because of the airborne stuff that's coming off coal trains or coming off various other interesting entities that carry toxins, partially because water tables carry toxins underneath and it goes into the soil, it gets leached in. And most of Newcastle had some heavy industries on it at one point. So we know that a lot of soils in and around our city are highly toxic. That's actually post-industrial cities. Most cities have some toxic land, and often they have fairly high levels that are much over EPA standards on various lands. So if you're ever going to buy land, I'd urge you to get your soil tested first. But we decided to approach this in particular to have a kitchen garden, a typical garden with, annual flowers and veggies. And I'll go into that in more detail, but it's kind of something you might do at home. A cottage garden, which is in keeping of the style of the house, a shrub border. It's something that a lot of people did at that time to kind of cover up the foundations. And it's a very kind of English tradition that Australia has kind of taken in and made its own. We planted orchards with underplantings, and when I say orchards, they're not necessarily fruit orchards. They're both native and exotic trees, which have underplantings that we're also testing what happens in the perennials and the shrubs underneath them. So they also do a bit of companion planting, which helps the trees grow because they become a little bit less susceptible when they're babies. And then the bottom, we decided to do what's called broad acre planting. So we planted 2 different meadows. And in the first year, we had the same meadows on both sides of, and I'll show you some pictures of that. But this year, we decided to do 2 different meadows, one with sunflowers and one with a big mix. And you'll see the results soon, hopefully. So, all right. Vegetables, herbs, fruit, and bedding plants. Why are we interested in what they might absorb? Well, there's the obvious one. So if you happen to live in a house or in a flat and you have a garden outside in the ground, and you might be on a site that has some toxins that aren't necessarily good for you, you want to know what absorbs it, what doesn't, what actually happens there. If you've got flowers, do your flowers absorb toxins where then the bees and then the other pollinator species and other things, and that series of ecological enchainments happens? I mean, there's a whole range of things you want to find out. But so this is a veggie garden, first and foremost, but we did plant some flowers, and we had some, interesting, bit feral gardeners, but really, if a plant, a vegetable, holds it in its roots, but it's not a root-based vegetable, so let's say it's spinach leaves, you might still, when we're testing the spinach for, say, heavy metals, or we're testing it for benzene, or we're testing it for some of the phosphates and some of the things that creosote and some of the herbicides that are often sprayed on sites to keep weeds down. So we're testing it for all these things. And if you're planting spinach and the roots hold the toxins and they take them out of the soil, but they don't go in the leaves, that means the leaves might be safe. We have to test the toxin levels. I don't know that I would recommend eating any of these vegetables off our site because it is highly contaminated land. But the whole point here is to try different vegetables and to find out where they hold the toxins, if they absorb them at all. If they don't absorb them, that tells you something really interesting. That means you might be able to grow certain crops in places where they don't absorb the toxins, so they're toxin resistant and they're safe to eat. I have to talk about, the hero at the moment, which are carrots. So carrots we found in the actual root, which is the vegetable that you eat, absorb huge amounts of arsenic. So much so that they not only do the immediately adjacent soil, but there's a very large radius of soil around them that they absorb the arsenic out of. So they're hyperaccumulators. So these carrots are highly, even though they look incredibly healthy and they don't look weird or anything, but these carrots absorbed so much toxin in terms of arsenic that we found that we had trace levels of arsenic left where we planted them when we started off with much higher levels than it was acceptable. Now that's pretty exciting. It tells you, A, don't ever plant carrots in the ground if you live in soils that have been found to have arsenic in them. And if you live in a mining area, chances are you do. But B, that carrots, simple carrots that are very cheap to grow, very easy to maintain, can actually clean land. And this is our famous scientist, Megan. And she's often, we've all learned how to sample. And why it's like she's going after some capsicums, but she's very, very interested in the whole ecology of this whole project. But she's also helping us understand other things that we can test that haven't been tested anywhere in the world. So the second garden is a bit longer term. So obviously a vegetable garden and a flower garden is generally an annual garden, and we replant and change our planting all the time over the year, and we replant it year to year. So it's quite a quick experiment. We're looking at things that will work quickly and do bigger projects out that last a bit longer further out. So the cottage garden is one of those. And really, so when you look at the cottage, it's kind of a very, looks like every other, I would say, Federation house of this era, has a really incredible veranda. But you'll notice that this big yellow plant is kangaroo paw, which is a native plant. And then we have some very normal kind of what you would find in an English cottage garden, because we want to test what those do. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about what are called litmus plants. So some plants, when they have hazardous materials in the soil, turn into really funky colors. The hydrangea is one of those plants. So we call them litmus plants. So they absorb certain toxins and they cause changes to their coloring. So this is what that plant is supposed to. It's supposed to just have a little tinge of pink. This is on one part of the site where it's kind of got a little funky pink. And this is where there must be huge amounts of, in this case, iron, and it's gone bright pink, which is kind of a really crazy thing. We're also interested in natives versus non-natives. Now, there has been a significant amount of work on non-natives. So North American species and also species that grow in and around Europe, mainly Germany, there's been a fair bit of field testing. But native Australian species, we haven't been doing phytoremediation in this country for very long. A lot of laboratory tests, but not a lot of in the ground. So native species are really important because in Australia, of course, we have a love of our natives and we're very interested in what toxins they can take out using their systems. So moving on to the orchards and underplantings. So we always give our clients, in this case, the university, a kind of look of what it's going to look like. And this is now what it does look like. You can see here that we underplanted the trees with grasses, and grasses are some of the best, sometimes ornamental. In this case, these two happen to be natives, Femina and kangaroo grass. But grasses, because of the way their roots are structured, it's called rhizomes. They are some of the best phytoremediators, but we didn't have any trials in Australia on native grasses. So we did this and we're getting fantastic results on benzenine, which is a fairly scary, it's kind of what you find after a gas station leaves. Benzenine is a really powerful petrochemical. And you can see just beyond where our site is, and I'll get into this in a minute, but these are some magnolia trees. We chose magnolias because they're very typical in yards in and around Newcastle. In other places, we've chosen gum trees and crepe myrtles. So it's a big, different range of trees. The plan for the trees after they get to a certain height, and they're not the ones that we test, because we have to take them out and test the whole tree. The ones that we're keeping, we're going to actually relocate because they will already be ready for toxic soils. And in other sites, unfortunately, on our campuses, particularly the city campus, we have some soil challenges there. You can see from this image also that we are not far away from current industry in Newcastle. So we might be looking at this one particular parcel of land, but there's a heck of a lot of space for our project to grow, literally. So these are some close-up of the trees, and obviously two natives, and sorry, not necessarily obviously. So these are native acacia, these are native gum trees, and this is a crepe myrtle tree, which are fairly prolific throughout the world these days. And we're really interested in how we have a nursery that can help other sites, but also how we can find out what our natives do. The last part of this garden is the meadows, and this is really about broadacre planting. And why broadacre planting is really significant is that, you can do it really quickly, really cheaply, and I mean, meadows are quite beautiful. As you can see, this is our first year we did cornflower meadows, but essentially, and a mix of other things, but cornflowers and poppies primarily. But if you're a land developer and you're on a toxic site, You want to be able to treat a large tract of land, and you don't want it to be like garden plots, like say vegetables or say some of the stuff you saw in the orchards or at the cottage garden. And those gardens are going to be in place for up to 15 years, where this is something you can do 1 year or 2 years. You can do it very quickly, very cheaply, and you can clean out so many toxins at once. So our first year, we did, like I said, cornflowers and a mix of poppies. And again, we are very adjacent to heavy industry. This is a steelworks. And we got pretty interesting. We had a very hot summer, so we got pretty interesting results. But this is this year. So that was 2020, and this is 2021, 2022. It went bazoolas. We've had a very, El Nino has kind of helped us. You know anything about gardens, particularly in Australia, we always need a bit of water, and it's just gone crazy. And it's incredibly beautiful, but these plants are working very hard to take out some very significant toxins. Not having a good mouse day, are we? And you can see that this is much more variety. So poppies and zinnias and some native stipers and some, this is a huge variety. And often when we're planting these seed mixes, we don't actually know what's going to come up. So the first year when it was all blue with cornflowers, it was incredibly beautiful, but we had no idea that the other things weren't going to come up. And that's partially because of some of the toxins, partially because of the growing conditions. And we have to test this very rigorously with our science team. The other side of the meadow, we actually planted sunflowers this year because we knew we had high concentrations of lead. And as you can see, sunflowers are quite impactful. They'll grow in sun and in a little bit of shade, and we have some very old growth old growth trees on site. But importantly, sunflowers often have bees and pollinator species with them. And so what we're interested with the sunflowers is not just the fact that they draw up a lot of lead, but do they hold it in their stems? Do they hold it in their leaves? Do they hold it in their flowers? If they hold it in their flowers, we know that we're risking pollinator species. And so that when in future projects, if we do a lot more broadacre work, we don't plant a lot of sunflowers because we're worried about the ecology of the site and the ecological enchainments. We do a lot of outreach with this project, lots of garden clubs, lots of school kids, DIY, do-it-yourself advice, exhibitions, films, and that's because we want this to be very accessible. We don't want it to be something that we write out about as academics and publish in highly esteemed journals. We actually really want to be a public-facing, and our website has all our results. We have exhibitions. This is one around resilience, and you can see that we share what plants take out what. So, and we also talk a lot about the ethnobotanic significance of certain plants. So that means like the cultural history of plants. And why this is it's really good to know that pumpkins take out DDT if you happen to have a DDT problem. But I mean, it's also that plants and fruits and vegetables and flowers have cultural significance. So we include a lot of research around it. And again, you'll see most of the native plants if you go to our website and look at our tiles. We have hundreds of these things now. Most of the native Australian plants, we don't know what they absorb yet. We also include this on our website. We show if you've got lead issues on your site and you know that, if you know you've got some serious toxicity around lead, these are the plants that will take it away. And this isn't an extensive list. This is what we've trialed, and we're giving you their performance in terms of milligrams per kilograms. Similarly with arsenic, we provide a downloadable do-it-yourself guide. So if you live in Newcastle or you live in a place with toxic soils, which most cities have these days, you can download this guide to help you do it, how to take a soil sample, where to get sampled, how to take care of a plant, because some people have never planted a plant, where they might take it up in, how phytoremediation works, how you dispose of it properly, because of course, if you grow toxic plants and you take the toxins out of the soil, you don't want to compost them back into the soil because you're putting the toxins back in. So we often compost them and then we test the sludge because there's a whole other there's another process where composting breaks down certain things, and some toxins are actually eliminated through composting. We test the sludge before it starts, we test the sludge after it starts, and then eventually, once we have the sludge that isn't going to break down anymore, we do have to take it off site. just want to end there back on what I said I was going to do in the beginning, which is define radical hope. So radical hope is something I learned about from a scholar named Jonathan Lear, and he was looking and he was interviewing Chief Plenty Horse, who was the last of his kind, the last of his language group. He was a First Nations person, Crow. He was a Crow person. And imagine being the last of your culture, and what does that make you think about your cultural traditions and how things may be devastated? You might lose your entire culture because you're the last person. But in his work with Chief Plenty Horse, he learned that this man had this incredible faith that their traditions and that life would carry on even after he had left, without knowing what the future would be, without knowing, because this is, this radical change that was happening at the time. He had this idea that he had hope beyond hope. So one of the reasons I think we have a very fragile planet, both ecologically, socially, and one might even argue economically. COVID has taught us all that we probably need to change our practices. And it's also meant that maybe as designers, our value isn't just that we're incredibly lateral and that we can connect things that other people don't, but it is to understand how we can work with places that really need us, but also to maybe envision a bit of radical hope and understand that I don't know what the outcome of most of my projects are going to be, and most of my collaborators don't know, but we understand that climate change and land degradation and gender equity, all the, gender inequities, are so challenging. And, in this COVID world, what can we do? It sometimes gets on top of us. And I guess radical hope inspires me to think about, well, I don't know, but I know we're facing a humanitarian crisis. I know we're facing a planetary crisis. I have no idea what that outcome of that is going to be but I do know that I want to do projects that might make a difference. So with that, I want to thank you very much for inviting me once again. And I'm so sorry I couldn't be online live. It just happened to be in a very interesting place in the world with not a lot of internet. So thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.